if they sound like a psychopath, they look like a psychopath, and they've got the brain of a psychopath, then let's assume that they are a psychopath and not allow them to run countries.
Welcome back to Mind Matters, everyone. I'm Harrison Cayley, and I've got Ilan Martin in the studio with me. Today, we are pleased to be interviewing Dr. Clive Boddy. Clive is, let me open up your bio here, Clive. You're associate professor in the Faculty of Business, I believe, at Anglia Ruskin University. And you have a variety of research interests, including corporate psychopathy. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. The Faculty of Business and Law, sorry. And this is a topic that's interested me in, well, probably for the last 15, 16 years, probably since Paul Babiak and Robert Hare published their book, Snakes in Suits, maybe a bit before that. First, to start out with, could you tell us a bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got interested in this topic in particular?
I started with this topic for my DBA, Doctor of Business Administration degree, which I did back at Curtin University in Australia in 2009-ish, and before that. And I read a small piece in Harvard Business Review, which talked about executive psychopaths. And I realized that I had worked with somebody who would score highly on some of those characteristics. And therefore I adopted it as a piece of doctoral research and been doing it ever since, basically.
Well, I had an interesting conversation with someone I know recently who's worked in HR for decades. And I've heard depending on who you talk to, whether it's employees or just people on the street or people who work on HR, sometimes you get the impression that they say like, oh, well, everyone at all the CEOs are psychopaths or et cetera, or in business. I wonder if there's any research done to kind of either tone that down a bit, or is it like, how prevalent is psychopathy in the workplace? Do we have any idea of what's really going on there?
Well, roughly they're 0.6 to 1.2 of the adult population. Mm. The theory is the higher up you go, the more of them there are in organizations because they seek money, power, and control over other people. So they might be attracted to some sectors of the economy more than others. So, for example, if corporate banking gives you the opportunity for more money, power, and control, then you might go into that sector rather than the caring professions, which are less well paid, like nursing or being a beautician or working in a care home, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I think it was Babiak and Hare's work, one of their pieces of research that showed that around 3.9% of the top of organizations have psychopathic people in them. Mm-hmm. And it's probably 1% at the bottom, in line with, the adult population figures.
Yeah. So maybe like four times as prevalent in those top positions, you might say, give or take.
Yes. I mean, there's very little research on this, on the incidence rates or the way they spread through organizations, but what research there is does support that view.
Well, I was looking through your papers. You've got many papers published, a lot of them on this topic. And so the other day I was just going through some of them and seeing what I could find, the ones that were available, or just reading the abstracts if they weren't, the full versions weren't available just online. And in one of these articles, I don't have the title with me, but this was the first paper, or the first paragraph that you wrote with your co-author. No matter which sector organizations occupy, a generic factor that middle managers identify as being critical to success is effective leadership. Notwithstanding, Hogan puts the base level of ineffective leadership at around 65%. This is to the extent that up to 70% of employees would take a pay cut if their immediate superior was fired. Moreover, between 60 and 75% of employees report that the worst part of their job is dealing with their superior, who is thus the main influence on employee job satisfaction. So this actually gets into another topic that I wanted to get into, is kind of the how this intersects with job satisfaction. So is this just, well, maybe you could tease this out. How much of this is like a really toxic, like psychopathic boss, and how much of it is just incompetence? And do we have any idea why this situation obtains? Like, how does this develop to create this situation where so many people are just totally dissatisfied with their job, their superior, to the extent that they'd be willing to take a pay cut if they got fired?
Yeah, I'm quoting Robert Hogan's work there, who's a very good writer on leadership. You may know him already. Yeah, he's not differentiating there between psychopathic leadership and inept leadership. And indeed, when you work for inept people, it does feel like a toxic situation. But the key difference is there's no malevolence behind their stupid decisions, if that's the right way of saying it. Whereas with a toxic leader or a psychopathic leader, there is self-interested malevolence behind it. So and in any work situation, your boss sets the culture, the tone, the ethics of the organization that's most immediate to you, and therefore they have a huge influence on whether you like your job or not. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think Robert Hogan's figures come from. Because your boss is such an important influence on your work life. And if you have a good boss, it's great, and you just get on with it. And if you don't, then it becomes a constant struggle to try and do your job properly and to try to compensate for him or her not doing their job properly as well. So you end up working more than one job, because typically they've got there because they're prepared to lie, or they've fraudulently claimed competencies and qualifications that they don't really have. And therefore, when they get appointed, they can't really do the job they've been appointed to, and somebody else has to do it. Typically, those who are below them, who then have the burden of doing more than one job.
Mm-hmm.
It closely links to job satisfaction, as you've hinted,
right?
Because the influence of the leader has such a big influence on how happy or otherwise you are in your work environment. So I did some stuff with Ross Taplin, who's a professor of statistics, looking at the influence of job satisfaction on psychopathy on job satisfaction. And we found there's a whole variety of routes whereby lessened lower levels of job satisfaction occur. So there's things like verbal abuse, bullying, ridicule, sarcasm in the workplace. So there's lots of indirect ways they affect job satisfaction, but there's also a direct way as well from their personal behavior directly to the employee concerned. And in one of the bullying papers that we reanalyzed, we realized that from some of the qualitative research we did, the scale we used in the bullying paper was inadequate to capture the extent and ferocity and regularity of the bullying that can occur under a corporate psychopath. And statisticians would tend to see the extreme cases as outliers, which are not necessarily representative of what psychopaths do. But I beg to differ. These more extreme cases where you get multiple bullying behavior every day from the same person, sometimes in an open office so everybody can see it, it's just so extreme that it goes beyond the boundaries of most of the ways we try and measure these things. So we came to the conclusion that you have to measure that in sheer numerical way. How many times a day did you see this person bullying people? And then it goes through the roof when you do that.
Well, when you look at this picture, I mean, that you've painted for us just very briefly of of a workplace environment with a superior or a boss like this, I mean, it really, for me, it really exposes like a certain view as being just not true. So there's this view, and I know you've written about this too, that psychopathic traits can be an advantage in the workplace, and well, it might be a good thing in certain ways. How do you see that? Do you see any advantage whatsoever, or is this kind of like just a complete misreading of the situation that some people have?
Oh, I think some psychologists have equated psychopathy with success, but you have to remember that psychologists look at things from an individual point of view. So they might say, does being good looking help your career prospects? Does being tall help your career prospects? And they'll probably find that it does. And so the way they've approached this is they've said, okay, does having psychopathic traits affect your career progress? And it does. It helps you get ahead because of all these characteristics they have, like the willingness to lie and their lack of emotional responsiveness, which makes their lying less obvious because they don't have the neuroses and nervous tics and emotional reactions that the rest of us have. So when they are telling lies, it looks like they're telling the truth. And so they are able to get ahead in that way and move up the hierarchy. So, what was the original question there?
Oh, well, so
I've gone off on a tangent.
I'll go off on what you're saying. So there is, when looked at in an individual way, there is that element of success because it is true, but there's a wider picture, right?
Well, exactly. Yeah, I leave it to psychologists to look at psychopaths themselves and how their brains work and what they think of themselves internally and that kind of thing. I always look at their implications for wider society, for their colleagues, for the people they work with, for the organizations, for global sustainability, because they have no care for any other people apart from themselves because of this lack of emotional connectivity with people. This means that they really don't care about the future or about their own children or about their wives or anything like that. So they are disconnected to anything that relates to anything but their own levels of satisfaction and success. So from a personal point of view, they're successful. I mean, they walk away with millions while everybody else gets fired, for example, in an organizational setting. But from a wider perspective, then there's no success about it at all for anyone else apart from the psychopath that's concerned.
Right. And
so
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say psychologists tend to fall in the trap of having this narrow view of what success means for people. And it tends to be individualistic and materialistic as well. Right.
And so, well, this relates to something I've read in the works of Peter Turchin, and he wrote a book called Ultra Society about cooperation. And one of the points he made there and other places too is that even though in a capitalist environment, it's all about competition between firms and corporations and things like that, and maybe individuals too. When you look at it, a company like a corporation, it's the corporation that's competing with another corporation, and in order to do so, they need to cooperate within the corporation or within the business or within the company. In order to do something as a group, you need that internal cooperation. And so when you look at it just from an individual perspective, like just the one psychopath and his success moving up the corporate hierarchy, you're not looking at the actual value of not looking at the productivity and the effectiveness and the cohesion and cooperation of the group itself, which is the wider company and the wider workplace. So that would seem to me to be probably a more important way of looking at success is how does the actual business get run? How do the people work together? Because even when we're just talking about inept and incompetent superiors, like in that other paper and that other researcher who you quoted, when you have 70 or anywhere from 50 to 70% of your workforce that is totally dissatisfied with their job and with their superior, they're not going to be, giving it 100%, right?
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of disengagement. If you're not happy, then you put less than your best effort into things. And particularly, you don't go the extra mile for the organization, especially if the organization doesn't reciprocate.
Right.
And we've even found, in the case where there is lots of bullying and abuse and psychopathic management, tyranny, in other words, the people will even start to engage in counterproductive work behavior like sabotage, deliberately messing the environment, deliberately making mistakes, as a way of getting back at the organization which has foisted this tyrannical and unreasonable leader upon them. So that it's kind of, in a way, it's a little bit misguided retaliation because you're retaliating to the company, but it should be more directed at the leader themselves. But I suppose it's the only avenue that people have to express their dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm. Well, what can be done, or what should be done? So I've got a few questions here. Maybe I'll start with the one specifically on corporate psychopathy. So I know there are some organizations, like you've got one. What's the name of the corporate psychopathy research group that you have?
It's just a website.
It's just a website. Okay.
.org, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Used to be.
Well, I know there are a bunch of researchers that look into this. I mean, Paul Babiak is one who wrote Snakes in Suits. I'm wondering if there are any, or have been any, interventions, like if there are corporations who either hire people or who read the academic work like yours or Babiak's or anyone else's and actually try to do something about it. Do you have any stories or any studies about anything that's been attempted to try to take this into account and do something about it, even just at the hiring stage? What can companies do?
I read one piece in, I think it was the Financial Times, but I can't remember exactly. That said a management consultancy group used a psychologist to assess one of their applicants, and he decided that the psychologist decided that the person was psychopathic to some extent, and so they turned him down, and he ended up going into the financial services sector afterwards. In my own research, we had somebody within a UK charity who was trying to fight a rearguard action against the new CEO who had taken over and was doing negative things to the company. But ultimately failed in that, and he was the last one to leave. So basically, in this charity, a great quote from, I think it was him actually. He said, "With the last boss, we would have followed him to hell and back. With this boss, we wouldn't even follow him to the local pub." It says everything you need to know about his leadership qualities. But in that charity, everybody left. 100% of people left. And even more than that, because the replacements started to leave as well. As soon as so they sort of went from being really proud of what they were doing in the charity and what their jobs were, and what their roles that were, to being totally disenfranchised. What's the right word I'm looking for? Unhappy with what was going on there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And as I said, he tried to fight against it by reporting the CEO to the board of governors of the charity. But by that time, the CEO had become golfing buddies with the chairman of the board of governors and had undermined what he thought the guy was going to say, so that he wasn't believed in the end.
Wow.
Well, I'd like to follow up on something you just said, Clive, because you said that the psychologist did an assessment of a possible employee, determined he had these negative traits, and then this potential employee actually went into the financial services sector. Because some years ago, I had, and I couldn't say where it was or who did the analysis, but someone was looking at an application for a job within the financial services industry. I think it was a company on Wall Street in New York. And the assessment of the application was that it actually selected for psychopathic traits. And I don't recall reading anything since then, but I was just wondering if you'd ever come across any information or job applications that and companies that were actually looking for people who demonstrated a level of aggressiveness or selfishness or psychopathic traits that
maybe intentionally or not, or unintentionally,
or maybe unintentionally. Yeah.
Yeah, there was one media company in Australia once who were quite openly advertising for people with those kind of traits. It was just a small company, but more importantly, I think I once published a paper called the Corporate Psychopaths Theory of the Global Financial Crisis. And it got quite a lot of media attention at the time. And as a result of that, a financial journalist called Basham, I think his name was talking to a friend of his who was a corporate banker. And the corporate banker said to the journalist, in my bank, we used a psychopathy measure to bring people in, not to keep them out. So presumably they thought that these ultra-competitive, ruthless characteristics would be of benefit to the bank against their competitors. But of course, these people are out for themselves. They're not out for the people that employ them. And so they'd be equally destructive to the organization within as well. And when I've looked at feedback to this theory that there are corporate psychopaths in the financial services sector, at first my academic colleagues were sort of highly dismissive of the whole idea. Well, the whole idea of corporate psychopaths in the first place, because the paradigmatic view of psychopaths at the time, back in 2005, was that they're all in prison, more or less. So there was the two words, the juxtaposition of corporate and psychopath didn't go together. And I used to get papers dismissed within 30 minutes of sending them into academic journals. So they can't have read more than the title itself before they got rid of it, sent it back to me. But when you look at the views of financial insiders themselves, it's almost like, well, yeah, here's a stupid academic stating the absolutely obvious that we're all aware of anyway. So to the academics, it was new and startling. To financial insider, it was, yeah, we all know that anyway. What's the big news?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That was quite revealing in itself.
Well,
so on the Bloomberg site where it was reported, there's probably around between 200 and 300 comments afterwards. And if you read the comments, a lot of them just, accept the theory as being highly probable. The theory that psychopaths were.
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up on that point because recently James O'Keefe here in the U.S. we have this very intrepid journalist named James O'Keefe, who was formerly of Project Veritas, and now he's got his OMG News group, where they go undercover and get people in politics, in media, in corporations to say things in these off-the-cuff interviews and reveal rather insightful truths about how things work. So his most recent revelation was with an interview with a recruiter for BlackRock and named Serge Valley. And this young guy is basically coming out and saying, yeah, the war in Ukraine is just great for business. And we can buy politicians in Washington for $10,000 or, for really cheap. And he sounded rather giddy about the way things work and the power that his company was able to yield. And I thought it was, it's so revealing on so many levels, of course, that one of the people that recruits for this megalithic corporation, BlackRock, would have such a blasé and matter-of-fact and unconscientious approach to these realities. And, of course, it made me think of what BlackRock is, this multi-trillion-dollar corporation that wields an extraordinary amount of power globally on other corporations, enforcing these ESG scores, the environmental, social, and governance scores that they're, imposing on a lot of these other corporations in order to fit the bill of fitting into this new corporate paradigm. And so I was wondering if, we're talking about bullies that exist on an individual level within these corporations. But as you mentioned in one of your talks, you implied that Enron, when it existed, was itself as a body, as a corporation, a bit of a bully with other corporations. And so,
yeah,
and we see the same dynamic with BlackRock. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or comments on the fact that some of these corporations in and of themselves are intrinsically psychopathic and bullying.
Well, there's the thesis from, what is his name, Joel Bakken, is it, the corporation? That corporations in their setup, their legal establishment and setup are at best fundamentally amoral and at worst psychopathic in that they seek profit above all else. But yeah, the leadership, as I said earlier, sets the tone at the top. And when you have the three guys that you mentioned, Enron, when you have the three guys at the top who all have fairly highly developed psychopathic tendencies and characteristics, then the whole place becomes bullying and abusive, and it spreads, from the top down in terms of a total. They had a well-developed code of ethics, but everybody ignored it because of the example of the top people ignoring it. So all the codes and regulations in the world don't mean anything if the leaders demonstrate that they themselves are taking no notice of it. I mean,
right.
One of the things that I think comes into play here, and I haven't really probably emphasized this enough in my previous papers, it struck me that there's someone called Michael Levinson who developed a self-report psychopathy scale, the measure that he used, and I sometimes use as well. In one of his pieces of research, he reckons that around 23% of males, he doesn't mention females, around 23% of males are sufficiently psychopathic, the sort of mid-range levels, to be problematic for society if they're given the chance to let those characteristics flourish. So if you get a series of psychopaths at the top of an organization like Enron, and it recruits that type of person because they're attracted to ruthless, reckless, competitive, potentially high-paid jobs, then over time, through the attrition cycle, people who don't like it leave, people who do like it stay, the whole organization gets more and more psychopathic in its entirety. So I think, and the three top people in the German Nazi Party in the 20th century were also all diagnosed as psychopaths. Hitler in 1933, Goering at the Nuremberg war trials, and Hess when he landed in Scotland in 1941 to arrange some kind of peace deal with the British. So when you get all three of the top people who are highly psychopathic, has an enormous effect on those below them. And these people with much less developed psychopathic traits are just allowed to behave badly and immorally and unethically because there's nothing to stop them. There's no punishment. There's no restraint on that behavior. And indeed, there are probably rewards for that behavior rather than restraints on it. It becomes systemic.
Yeah. Well, I want to tie this into something you said just a bit before by going back in time a bit. So you said that back in like 2005, when you were writing these papers, even the idea of corporate psychopathy kind of turned a lot of people off. No, that's not possible. They're all in prison. Well, I found a few years after that, I work for a publishing company that like an independent publisher that publishes a book called Political Ponerology, which was written by a Polish psychologist on basically the thesis in a sentence would be that the totalitarianism of the 20th century was largely a result of the presence of psychopaths inspiring and operating these political movements or governments or state systems. And so I went to a couple psychopathy conferences in, like, I think 2009, 2010. One was an SSSP conference in New Orleans. And so I tried to give a bunch of copies of the book out to a bunch of researchers. And I found that I can't remember the name, so I won't reveal this person, but I was having a conversation with one of them, and I said, and I was talking about like CIA operatives, like assassins or something like that. And I said, oh, well, don't you think there's a chance that there are psychopaths within, the like government structures? Don't you think that's a thing? And this person said to me, oh, no, they screen out for all that kind of stuff. Someone like that could never get into a position of influence, like within the American government or any level of the American government, apparently. And I was just like, well, okay. And like very little response. I talked to a lot of them, and some kind of showed interest, but the idea of political psychopathy I found was, corporate psychopathy had been accepted to a degree, but the idea of political psychopathy, that was kind of like way off the charts. But now in the last 5 years or so, it's finally getting some recognition, kind of like I think corporate psychopathy did. And I haven't read your book yet, A Climate of Fear, Stone Cold Psychopaths at Work, but I ordered a copy, and I was just looking through the Amazon preview, and I noticed that you've got a chapter on political psychopathy, where from just looking through it, you mentioned some of the things you just said about like the top Nazi guys. Like I read Gustav Gilbert's book. He was one of the Nuremberg psychologists that you quote in there. Yeah. And he wrote a book in 1950 called The Psychology of Totalitarianism, which unfortunately is out of print. I'm going to try to do a reprint because it's in the public domain now. But he's got a whole chapter on Goering, for instance. I wrote an article about it. It's kind of summarizing some of what I found to be the most entertaining and funny bits about Goering's psychopathy, because he gives all kinds of stories about his interactions in Nuremberg with the other inmates and with all of the doctors, and how he'd set everyone against each other. And he was just like a total slimeball during this whole time. And so Gilbert concluded that, yes, psychopathy played an important they played the role of an important nucleus within the revolutionary Nazi movement, like from the beginning. So it was an essential part of how that whole system developed. So I just wanted to throw that all out there and ask what your view on kind of political psychopathy is and how that's progressing, and just any kind of thoughts in any direction you have on that.
Yeah, I recently had turned that some of the stuff in that chapter into a paper on Hermann Goering, and how he was. I think I call him a dark triad personality, because he was Machiavellian and narcissistic and psychopathic at the same time. And you can, personally, I think Machiavellianism and psychopathy are probably the same thing, and the overlap is so great. It's just people from different disciplines using different words to describe the same person. Narcissism is quite different, really. But I think Hermann Goering was narcissistic as well as psychopathic. And if you look at the pictures of him with all his ribbons and bows and medals and his field marshal's baton, He clearly felt the need to be admired and loved, which is sort of evidence of narcissism.
Or worshipped.
Yeah. And narcissism, I think, and there's no real evidence for this, but I think once it's co-inhabits with psychopathy, it moderates the psychopathy. It makes it a little bit less, because these guys want to be liked and want to be loved and want to be admired, even if it's just by their followers, who may be a minority of people, but they still want that adoration, and that stops them doing the more extreme things that they might have done otherwise. And I think that probably applies to one of your recent presidents.
Yeah.
The narcissism might have moderated the more extreme things that he would have done if he wasn't narcissistic as well as psychopathic.
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. I actually had that article, a quote from it. So that article that you're referencing that you wrote is Populism and Political Personality, What We Can Learn from the Dark Triad Personality of Hermann Göring. I'll just read a couple sentences from the abstract. So, utilizing a case study of Hermann Göring's character and behavior, this paper examines the darkest personality within the dark triad of personalities, that of the psychopath, and discusses what can be expected from their leadership. The psychopathic leader's appeal to a large minority of voters is discussed alongside a discussion of whether they can be reliably identified, and if so, whether in the interests of global security and sustainability, psychopaths could be screened out of running for high political office. So I want to ask you about that last bit, because I don't think I read the paper. I don't think it was available when I was looking for it, but regardless, I haven't read it, so I don't know what you say on that. So what? So can they be reliably identified? I think you've already answered the question, yes, because like you said, the three top guys at various points were actually diagnosed during their lifetimes. But maybe in addition to that, what limits might there be on that process, on that possibility? And then should there be some kind of screening, and what are the prospects for that? Like what would we need to do in order to be able to implement something like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been arguing that there should be screening, as have other people, ever since I started to understand what the psychopath was. And I realize it raises all sorts of ethical issues. If you screen them out before they've done anything wrong, then, is that fair, etc. But I think with the most senior positions, especially in politics, where they have such a potential influence on life and death decisions for large groups of the population, it would seem sensible to, especially if they've got their hand on the nuclear trigger, it would seem sensible to try and make sure they've got some kind of care for their fellow humanity, for their fellow humans. Otherwise, it's an invitation to disastrous results. And I should mention here that recently there's been a large advancement in brain scanning technology for functional magnetic resonance imaging and things like that. And there's researchers like Kent Keel and Fallon who are becoming expert at identifying the psychopathic brain. So maybe for these most senior positions, it shouldn't be just a self-report psychopathy measure together with an other report psychopathy measure, but it also should be a brain scan as well, so that you've got three sources of triangulation. So if they sound like a psychopath, they look like a psychopath, and they've got the brain of a psychopath, then let's assume that they are a psychopath and not allow them to run countries.
Right.
I think that's a really good point, actually, about using that objective evidence of a brain scan. A few months ago, we had Sandra Brown, the author, researcher, therapist, author of Women Who Love Psychopaths, who was discussing her therapy with a lot of victims of psychopaths in relationships, a lot of women who had been devastated psychologically and emotionally. And one of the things that Sandra said that I found very interesting was that in helping her clients to understand the depth of the problem. She had actually presented to the women who were undergoing the therapy brain scans.
Yeah, neuroscience in general.
Neuroscience.
Yeah.
And it was those scans, that objective, in your hand.
Well, just not scans of the men themselves, just the like educational stuff. Yeah.
Yes. Just as a kind of an example of how different a healthy brain scan might look from someone who is psychopathic. And she said it had a profound effect on a lot of her clients. That was the kind of thing that helped the light go off in the minds of many of these victims. And so I thought, if that's what it takes in helping people to understand that there is this objective difference, aside from the questionnaires and the that whole process, then maybe that is a way of implementing greater education and screening for people.
I mean, people have said the same stuff, the same sort of thing when they've read my material, and they've said, all of a sudden I understood what happened, and it makes sense. And looking back on it, you can tell it was nothing to do with me as a person. It was just the situation I was in, and it would have happened to anybody who was in that situation. But yeah, a lot of them are, sexually promiscuous and have multiple affairs and exploit women for all sorts of things, including their money, if they can get away with it. And I think that happens in the workplace a lot more than, and I haven't really looked for it because it's so sensitive. But John Clark, in one of his books, Working with Monsters, I think it's called, the Australian psychologist, he said he found evidence of one guy who sort of slept his way through the whole of the female people in the department. And a lot of those women left and had various degrees of stress and post-traumatic stress syndrome, because he'd promised them all sorts of things. And of course, he was just using them. And as soon as he'd finished with them, then he just left them and didn't fulfill any of his relationship promises or career promises or whatever other promises that he'd made. But yeah, it's one of the things that they tend to like to do, because it's related to this lack of emotional connectivity. It's just they're just seeking thrills to replace the emotions that they don't have. So they need extra strong stimulus to give them the same pleasure or an approximation of the pleasure that other people have from normal relationships. So going home to your wife and family isn't of any particularly appeal to them. They want new conquests and new adventures and new stimulation all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about these groups, self-health groups. The people I feel quite often the most sympathy for or sadness over are the parents of some of the psychopaths. Because as a parent, I don't know if you guys are, but I've got daughters. As a parent, you tend to think, have I done a good job? Have I brought them up properly? And are some of their quirks because of something that happened with me? But if you've got a psychopath as a child, it's nothing to do with you. It's just the way they're born and the characteristics of their brain. And the parents can't blame themselves, even though they do blame themselves. They can't fairly do so because there's nothing they could have done about it, given the brain characteristics that they're faced with. And of course, as the psychopath child becomes more and more abusive as they get older, it's very sad for the parents to watch what's happening and not blame themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, that just made me think of the movie Well, I haven't watched it yet, but what do we do about Kevin? Is that the name of it? I've just heard about it, but I'm wondering if just that just made me think of other movies. Are there any films that stand out in your mind, like fictional representations that you think do a good job of portraying a lot of these dynamics and phenomena, or do you stay away from films?
Well, yeah, some people have asked me that before, and the shining example that I always think of is Star Wars. Senator Palpatine becomes the Chancellor, then he becomes the Emperor, and he's manipulating people. He kills his friends and supporters just like Hitler did. So to me, he's the perfect political psychopath. But nobody else has ever seems to identify him. They talk about, the Wolf of Wall Street and things like that, but to me, it's him. It's the Emperor.
Clive, we did a whole show on that.
Yeah,
and Anakin's and Anakin's kind of conversion to the dark side.
Yeah, the manipulation that he does on Anakin in particular, and just I think that Palpatine, like everyone says, I mean, I like Darth Vader. Darth Vader's a great character, but I think Palpatine is the greatest villain. One of the greatest film villains in history. So.
Yeah. Oh, I'll have to look at your podcast on that one. Yeah.
I'll try to find the link and send it to you. But I want to come back to the question of screening, and this applies also to what I said about, or what I asked about, corporate interventions. Is there? I know that as an academic and a researcher, it's your job to think of ideas and write ideas, and not necessarily to implement them in a real world way. But do you see that happening in any way, or do you have any ideas on how to actually make it happen? Does it need political lobbying? Does it need just a wider public awareness of these things, of these phenomena, and therefore, our emphasis should be on public education? Do you have any kind of idea of what the practicalities of actually doing something about this would be, actually implementing some kind of screening program?
Well, one thing I think you can do fairly easily is deliberately look for people who are caring and nurturing as leaders. And then if you do that, you're not setting out to discriminate against psychopathic people, but you inevitably will find nice people instead of mean people.
Right.
And so that's a sort of a positive way of approaching the same thing. Without deliberately screening them out, you're looking for their opposite. So you're looking for truly transformational leaders. So if you know the leadership literature, transformational leaders are deemed to be the best kind of leaders, because they inspire people and motivate people and transform not only the trajectory of the organizations they lead, but also the people within those organizations. And you, talking about transformational leaders has just reminded me. So a recent piece of research we did looked at the characteristics of transformational leaders and psychopathic leaders as judged by those who work for those two groups of people. So I asked people who had a transformational leader to rate them on a psychopathy scale. I didn't say it was a psychopathy scale, but I just asked them to rate them. Mm-hmm. And I asked people who had a psychopathic leader to rate them on the same scale. The most illuminating finding, which was very much in line with our theories around psychopaths, around corporate psychopaths, was that psychopathic leaders, when you first meet them, are even more poised, social, friendly, rational, attractive, psychologically attractive than transformational leaders are. And this is where I think where the big problem comes in, because it looks like you found an ideal leader, somebody who's going to be absolutely transformational. But unfortunately, those are the only cluster of attributes that they actually have that look like they're going to be good. Everything else is negative about them. And so we end up appointing these people based on their appearance and without adequate background checks and reference checks and qualifications checks. And so they get away with it. So the shallow screening mechanisms or recruiting mechanisms that we use these days in organizational appointments are not doing the job of weeding out the abusive and the tyrannical. And that's, as I said, that's how they're getting ahead. And I think they're getting ahead in greater numbers than ever before because we all move jobs so quickly these days. Now, if you back in the 50s and 60s, the idea of a job for life was a reasonable expectation, and so you'd get to know your colleagues, you'd get to know the people you work with, and if you knew they had aberrant personalities, you might try and stop them from getting promoted above you because you knew what would happen if they did. But these days, we don't really know our colleagues that well. And if we do, it's only for 2 or 3 years. And so we don't know their true personalities until they're in a position to display those personalities. And sometimes that works well, and sometimes it works badly. So we have to be more thorough in our selection and recruitment decisions and the way we do things.
Right. Do you think that there's any possibility, or this might just be an entirely theoretical question because it might not, probably corporations wouldn't choose to implement it, but at least theoretically, do you think that there could be a more like a revolution within the corporate world to democratize it and actually give the workers some say in like vetoing who their boss might be, their manager or something? Like, is there any wisdom that could be gleaned from the workers who actually have to work under a certain person? Like if 70% or if 100% of the workforce says, no, this manager is totally incompetent, totally inept, they have to get rid of him. Like, do you think that should be taken into account more than it is?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah. The problem with these people, these corporate psychopaths, is they are totally dedicated to upward impression management. So typically those above them think they're absolute stars and then unwilling to hear anybody below them saying negative things about them because they attribute it to jealousy or to being pushed too hard to work hard in the workplace. Because they spend the whole time networking upwards on their phone with their bosses, telling their bosses what great results they're getting, telling them how good they are, telling them how competent they are, and they're totally neglecting those below them. And this is basically one of Robert Hogan's arguments. A good leader takes care of those below them first and foremost, whereas a bad leader takes care of those above them first and foremost. And therefore, those above them don't really have a good reading of who's doing a good job in the organization and who isn't. If I've got my head down looking after the group of people I manage, then nobody above me is going to notice me unless I make loads of noise. And it's the people who make noise and are self-promoting who get promoted. So, yeah, I very much think that's a good idea to ask people, if you could choose your boss from among your colleagues, who would you choose and who would you not choose?
Interesting. Okay. Well, I know you're running out of time, Clive, so I think we'll end it there. I'll just end by saying that that one of your recent papers that just came out pretty recently is on kind of an analysis of the personality of Bernie Madoff. Is that correct?
That's right.
So I'll include a link. I'll include a link to your university page which has a list of all your recent articles on it. Is there are there any other resources or places that you'd want to direct listeners or viewers?
Well, I have a Google Scholar page, which is a sort of a summary of your papers over time. So that's a good place to start if you're interested in getting more information on corporate psychopaths.
All right, we'll do that. Okay. Yep. Great. Well, it was a pleasure talking with you, Clive.
Thank you for visiting with us today.
Yeah, and take care.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And we'll talk again sometime. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Nice to talk to you. Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.
Take care.